The two police officers walked into Callaway Print and Packaging at 9:17 on a Tuesday morning, right as I was trying to keep a 60,000 rush order from missing the shipping truck. One of them stopped beside the reception desk and asked, you Maren Callaway?" Every conversation around me died. I wiped a streak of blue ink off my hand and said yes. Before I could ask what this was about, my father stepped out of his office. He didn't look confused. He didn't ask why the police were there. He looked directly at me and said, "Just cooperate, Maren." That was when I turned toward my older brother, Nolan. He was standing beside Dad with his hands in his pockets, perfectly calm. He wasn't surprised either. The officers told me they were investigating $38,000 missing from an advance payment account belonging to one of our biggest clients, and the transaction records pointed to my credentials. For 8 years, I had managed the financial and operational systems that kept our family company running. Now half the office was watching two police officers ask me where $38,000 had gone. I looked at Nolan again, and one thought pushed everything else out of my head. My family knew they were coming. I didn't. I asked the officers whether I was under arrest. One of them, Officer Ramirez, shook his head. "We're gathering information right now." That should have made me feel better. It didn't. He showed me the date of the transfer and asked whether I recognized the account. I did. It was one of several accounts used to hold client advances before those funds were allocated to materials, vendors, and production costs. I normally had broad access because I handled operations and finance. Nolan handled sales. Dad owned the company and still approved major commitments, although he liked to say he was stepping back, while somehow attending every important meeting. "Did you authorize this transfer?" Ramirez asked. "Not that I remember." Nolan shifted beside Dad. "Just enough for me to notice." "Do you share your login information with anyone?" "No." "Could someone else have used your workstation?" "Possibly, but I'm not going to guess." I saw Nolan glance at Dad. I kept my eyes on the officer. "I can tell you exactly where I was that day once I check my calendar and production notes." Nolan finally spoke. "Maren had access. That's all anyone knows right now." His tone was reasonable, almost protective. That was Nolan's gift. He could put a knife on the table and make everyone thank him for bringing silverware. "I didn't ask you," I said. Dad exhaled through his nose. "Not here." That hurt more than I expected. Not because he told me to stop. Because he said it the way he did when Nolan and I were teenagers, and I was supposedly making something bigger than it needed to be. Except this wasn't an argument over a car or a missed family dinner. $38,000 was gone, and my name was attached to it. The officers asked several more questions. I answered only what I actually knew. I didn't accuse Nolan. I didn't start explaining 8 years of family history to two strangers. And I definitely didn't say the first thing running through my mind, which was that Nolan looked far too comfortable for a man who had just discovered his sister might have stolen from the family business. When the officers left, Dad shut his office door behind the three of us. "How long have you known?" I asked. He rubbed both hands over his face. "There were discrepancies last week." "That isn't what I asked." Nolan leaned against the filing cabinet. "Dad didn't want to accuse you before we knew anything. But he knew police might come here." Silence. I looked at Dad. "You knew. Nolan brought the account problem to me yesterday. And nobody called me. We needed to understand what we were dealing with. Apparently everyone needed to understand, except the person whose name was on it." Nolan straightened. "This isn't personal. I actually laughed once. I couldn't help it. Police walked into the company with my name attached to missing money, Nolan. I'm pretty comfortable calling that personal." Dad raised a hand. "Enough. Until we know what happened, I'm suspending your financial access." For a second, I thought I had misheard him. My access. Temporarily. And Nolan's. Nolan's jaw tightened. Dad looked away from me. "Nolan needs the sales and project systems to keep things moving." There it was. I had spent years being the person Dad called whenever payroll didn't reconcile. A vendor threatened to stop shipping paper stock, or production fell 2 days behind. Nolan was the one Dad brought to client dinners. Nolan sold possibility. I cleaned up whatever possibility cost after the contract was signed. I had always known Dad saw us differently. I had just never understood how dangerous that difference could become. "Put the suspension in writing?" I said. Dad blinked. "What?" "Email me exactly what access is being removed, and the exact time it takes effect." Nolan frowned. "Why are you making this so formal?" I looked at him. "Because somebody already made it formal when they called the police." 20 minutes later, our system administrator disabled my finance permissions while I stood beside my desk. I wrote down the time to 10:06 a.m., then I packed my notebook, my personal charger, and the coffee mug I'd left there since Friday. I wasn't being fired, technically. Dad told me to remain available while they figured things out. But when a woman who has run your operations for 8 years is suddenly told she can't touch the systems she built her job around, technical distinctions stop meaning much. I took an empty conference room and opened my calendar instead. If someone expected me to panic, they had misunderstood me. The transfer happened the previous Friday at 2:43 p.m. I knew immediately that I had not been sitting at my desk. A packaging run for a medical supply client had jammed because one of our cutting machines was rejecting an updated layout. I had spent most of the afternoon on the production floor with Tessa Ngayan, our production supervisor, trying to keep 4 pallets from becoming expensive scrap. I found the calendar entry, then 2 emails I had sent from my phone during the troubleshooting. It didn't prove I hadn't authorized anything remotely, but it gave me somewhere to start. Tessa appeared at the conference room door around 11. "Are you okay? Ask me after I figure out why my name is attached to $38,000. She stepped inside and closed the door. "Friday afternoon," I nodded. She stared at the date on my screen. "That's weird." "What?" "Nolan was asking me about finance job codes that week." My hand stopped over the keyboard. "What kind of job codes?" "I don't know. He wanted to know how vendor charges got assigned when sales added something after production approval." Nolan had never cared how vendor charges were assigned. In his words, that was Marin stuff. I thanked Tessa and told her not to start digging around for me. I wanted facts, not people accidentally changing records because they thought they were helping. Then I found Dad alone in the parking lot after lunch. "I need one answer," I said. "Before yesterday, had Nolan ever suggested that I might be having money problems?" Dad's face changed. "Not much, but enough." "Why?" "Because I'm asking." He hesitated. "A few weeks ago. He said you seemed under pressure." "How many weeks?" 3, maybe. I stood there looking at him while delivery trucks moved behind us. "What exactly did he say?" Dad lowered his voice. "That you might have some personal debt. That you'd been asking questions about refinancing your house. He said we should keep an eye on things." I hadn't asked Nolan for money. I wasn't drowning in debt. I had asked my bank about refinancing because interest rates had changed since I bought my townhouse. That was it. But suddenly I understood something I hadn't understood that morning. The missing money wasn't the first event in this story. 3 weeks before $38,000 disappeared, my brother had already started explaining to our father why I might be the kind of person who would take it. I could have marched inside and demanded answers from Nolan. Instead, I went back to the conference room, opened a fresh page in my notebook, and wrote his name at the top. Then I wrote one question underneath it. What was Nolan preparing for before there was anything to blame me for? By Wednesday morning, I had a list of everything Nolan had apparently used to convince Dad I was one unexpected bill away from stealing from my own family. The first was a $2,800 transmission repair from 4 months earlier. The second was a vacation I had cancelled in March. The third was the refinance inquiry Dad mentioned in the parking lot. On paper, I could almost see how Nolan had built the story. car trouble, cancelled trip, questions about lowering a mortgage payment. None of those things meant I was in financial trouble, but put them together in the right order. Lower your voice. Tell a worried father you're just concerned. And suddenly they sound different. What bothered me most was the refinance. I had never discussed it with Nolan. I had mentioned it once to Dad over Sunday dinner, which meant either Dad had repeated it or Nolan had overheard us. Neither possibility made me feel better. I wrote a short explanation beside each item and stopped there. I wasn't going to spend the next week proving I could afford my own life. If Nolan wanted everyone looking at my personal finances, I wanted to know what he hoped they wouldn't look at instead. When I arrived at the company, Dad was waiting near my old office. "Accounting may need you to clarify some entries," he said. "Fine, email me the questions." His eyebrows pulled together. "You're here. They can just ask you. I'm not logging into anything connected to the disputed accounts. Your access has been suspended." "Exactly. I want a clean line between what happened before 10:06 yesterday and anything that happens afterward." Dad stared at me for a second. "You're acting like we're the enemy." "No, I'm acting like 2 police officers came into my workplace because a transaction had my name attached to it." He looked tired, but I didn't rescue him from the discomfort. That was something I had done too often. Softened my own point the second Dad looked unhappy. "Email?" I repeated. "That way everyone knows what I was asked and what I answered." He finally nodded. I had barely made it to the conference room when my phone buzzed. "Tessa, you need to see what Nolan changed in production." I found her at the planning station overlooking the floor. Huge rolls of cardboard stock were stacked behind us, and the presses were loud enough that nobody could casually listen in. "I'm not asking you to search for anything you shouldn't," I told her. "I know." She turned her monitor slightly. "This is stuff I use every day." She showed me 3 production jobs from the previous month. Normally, each job entered production with a category tied to the client, sales order, material requirements, and vendor costs. These 3 had been moved after creation. "Moved where?" I asked. "Under an existing client category." "By who?" The request came from Nolan. I leaned closer without touching the keyboard. "Why?" Who said sales had structured it differently, and we needed to keep everything together until the account was finalized. That sounded like Nolan. He hated procedures that slowed a deal down, usually. He complained to me until I found a legitimate way to make the process faster. Apparently this time he had decided I was the process to avoid. "Did he say Dad approved it?" I asked. Tessa gave me a look, more than once. She clicked back to her planning sheet. One label caught my attention: regional expansion package. I read it twice. "What is that?" "I was hoping you knew." I didn't. That was the problem. Any real expansion involving new vendor commitments should have crossed my desk, because I built capacity forecasts and cash requirements. Nolan could negotiate a sales opportunity without me. He could not realistically promise a large production expansion without somebody figuring out how we would manufacture it. When did this first appear? About a month ago, before the missing transfer, before the police, and around the same time Nolan started telling Dad I had money problems. I asked Tessa to walk me through exactly what she remembered. She told me Nolan had come down to production twice, asking how jobs were coded when outside vendors were involved. Later, he instructed her team to move preliminary work into an existing client category. "I asked whether you had signed off," she said. "What did he say?" Tessa hesitated, probably because repeating it felt like taking sides. He said, "Dad knows. Don't worry about Maren signing off." I felt something inside me settle. Not relief, something colder and more useful. "Did you have any reason to think he was lying?" "No. He's Graham's son and head of sales. If he says Graham approved a sales project, I'm not going to call your dad every time and ask if his son is telling the truth." She was right. That was exactly why this worked. Our company had policies. but we also had 30 years of family habits sitting on top of them. Dad could approve something verbally. Nolan could tell someone Dad approved it. I could fix something without formal documentation because everybody knew I would. We had built a business where trust filled the gaps between written rules, and someone had figured out how useful those gaps could be. Don't change anything, I told Tessa. Don't copy files for me, don't move anything, and don't start asking people questions. Then what are you going to do? Find out whether Dad actually approved this. I caught him near the warehouse 20 minutes later. Regional expansion package, I said. His expression was blank. What about it? Did you approve it? Approve what? That answers part of my question. I explained only what I knew. Nolan had been moving preliminary production work under an existing client category and telling staff Dad knew about it. Graham's face tightened. Nolan was pursuing a regional packaging account. I knew that. Did you approve an expansion project? No. Did you authorize new vendor commitments for it? Not that I remember. He started toward the office. I stepped in front of him. Don't ask Nolan yet. Dad stopped. Why not? Because yesterday you suspended my access based partly on information Nolan gave you. Today I found a project he told employees you approved, and you're telling me you didn't. I want to understand what it is before he gets a chance to explain it for me. Dad didn't like that. I could see it in the way his mouth tightened. He's still your brother. And I'm still your daughter. That didn't stop you from taking my access away. He looked past me toward the production floor. For the first time since the police arrived, I saw uncertainty replace defensiveness. It lasted only a second. I'll give you a day, he said. It wasn't permission I needed, but I took the time anyway. That afternoon, I started mapping the hidden project from the outside in. I couldn't access the financial system, and I didn't want to. Instead, I used the parts of the business I had always understood better than Nolan did: production timing, job categories, vendor dependencies, and who had to know what before an order could move by 5 o'clock. I still couldn't tell you exactly where the $38,000 had gone, but I knew something more important. Nolan hadn't simply found a suspicious transaction and pointed Dad toward me. Weeks before the money disappeared, he had been changing the way a project moved through our company, telling employees not to worry about my approval, telling Dad to worry about my finances, and operating a project Dad himself said he never formally approved. I closed my notebook and stared through the conference room glass at Nolan laughing with one of our sales reps. Yesterday, I had been trying to answer one question: why did the records point to me? Now I had another. What had my brother been building inside our company that required him to keep me out of the way? By Thursday morning, Nolan had my job. Dad didn't phrase it that way. He called a meeting at 8 and stood in front of 23 employees with a printed sheet in his hand. Until the financial review is complete, he said, Nolan will coordinate sales and daily operations. Maren will remain available for transition questions, but all operational decisions should go through Nolan. Nobody looked directly at me at first. That almost made it worse. Tessa stared down at her clipboard. Our shipping coordinator shifted his weight. Nolan stood beside Dad, wearing the expression of a man accepting an unpleasant responsibility for the good of everyone else. Hopefully this is temporary, he said. We just need one clear chain of command. I nearly smiled at that. For years, Nolan had complained whenever our chain of command prevented him from promising something to a client before checking whether we could actually produce it. Now that the chain ended with him, apparently clarity mattered. I said nothing. Publicly arguing would only give him another version of me to sell defensive Maren, angry Maren making the company's problems about herself. The meeting ended, and employees scattered back toward their stations. Nolan followed me into the hallway. Where do you keep the vendor exception list? He asked quietly. I stopped. Which one? The list for vendors that can take overflow work without a full review. There isn't one list. His face tightened. You know what I mean. No, I know what you wish existed. Overflow decisions depended on materials, equipment, client specifications, turnaround time, freight, and whether the outside vendor had already been approved for that kind of work. Nolan had spent years treating those details like unnecessary obstacles. Now he owned them. You're supposed to help with transition questions, he said. That was a transition answer. I walked away before he could turn it into an argument. An hour later, I learned how quickly losing authority inside a family business could become losing credibility outside it. I called one of our longtime paper suppliers to clarify an invoice I had been tracking before my access was suspended. The account manager, Rick, sounded uncomfortable. Marin, I was told I'm supposed to run account questions through Nolan right now. Who told you that? Nolan did. Yesterday. He hadn't waited to see what the investigation found. He had started notifying people outside the company that I no longer had authority. Understood, I said. I won't ask you to go around that. There was a pause. For what it's worth, I hope everything gets sorted out. I hated that sentence. It was kind, but it confirmed exactly what I feared. Whatever story Nolan had told vendors, they knew enough to understand something was wrong with me. I thanked Rick and started to end the call when he added, I assume Nolan's handling that new high-volume deposit too. Which deposit? The outside capacity reservation, new regional account. I thought you were involved in that. My hand tightened around the phone. I'm not authorized to discuss it right now. That answer was technically true and strategically useful. After we hung up, I went straight to Tessa. We spent the next hour comparing what she could see in ordinary production records with information I already had from emails and scheduling notes. Slowly, the shape of the regional expansion package became clearer. Nolan had landed, or believed he was about to land, a large packaging contract with a regional food distributor to meet the volume. Callaway would need outside production capacity for part of the first run. Reserving that capacity required money up front. How much? I asked. Tessa pulled up the production estimate she had received from sales. I stared at the vendor line. The amount wasn't exactly $38,000 because the estimate included freight and materials, but it was close enough that my skin went cold. The missing money hadn't simply vanished into some mysterious account. It looked like at least a large portion of it had been used to support Nolan's expansion deal. That complicated everything. If he had transferred $38,000 into his personal checking account, the story would have been simple. This wasn't simple. Nolan could tell Dad he was investing in the company. He could tell investigators the transaction had a legitimate business purpose. And if my credentials were attached to it, he could claim I had authorized the money and then mishandled the records. Look at the pricing, Tessa said. I did. Then I recalculated it because I assumed I had missed something. I hadn't. Nolan had priced the contract as if we could produce nearly all of it internally. We couldn't. Once outside capacity, rush freight, and material waste were included, the margin nearly disappeared. If anything went wrong, the deal could actually cost us money. Promised this? I asked. Sales gave us the target numbers. Without capacity approval. Tessa nodded. I leaned back in the chair. For the first time, I could see a motive that made sense without turning Nolan into some cartoon criminal. He wanted the biggest account he had ever brought into Callaway. He wanted Dad to see him as the man who could take the company to the next level. He had promised more than our current operation could deliver, then needed money and outside capacity to make the promise real. Maybe he had told himself the contract would pay everything back before anyone noticed. Maybe the original decision had been reckless rather than malicious. But that still didn't explain why he had started telling Dad I had money problems before the transfer. That part required a different kind of decision. Around 3, Dad asked me into his office. Nolan was already there. We have a production issue with the regional account, Dad said. I know. Nolan folded his arms. Then you know we need your help? With what? Vendor allocation, scheduling, cost adjustments, the usual things. The usual things. The things I apparently couldn't be trusted to handle officially, but could still be trusted to fix quietly. Dad leaned forward. Merrin, nobody is asking you to take financial access back. We just need you to help Nolan get the production side stabilized until this is resolved. I looked from Dad to Nolan. Who has operational authority right now? Dad hesitated. Nolan. Then Nolan makes the operational decisions. Nolan gave a short laugh. This is childish. No, it's very simple. If I recommend a schedule and it fails, whose decision is it? We're all on the same team. That isn't what Dad told 23 employees this morning. Dad's expression hardened. You're still being paid. I'll answer questions about work I was responsible for. I won't make new decisions under Nolan's authority and then carry the responsibility when they go wrong. Nolan stepped closer to the desk. If this client walks because you refuse to help, Dad's going to remember that. I looked at him for a long second. There was the pressure he understood best. Not a threat exactly, a prediction. He still believed that if something broke badly enough, I would rush in and fix it, because I always had. If I didn't, he believed the failure could simply become another piece of evidence against me. Then make sure your decisions are good ones, I said. I walked out before Dad could call me back. My hands were shaking by the time I reached the conference room, but I didn't return. That was the first time in 8 years I knowingly allowed a company problem to remain someone else's problem. And sitting there with no financial access, no operational authority, and my reputation already leaking beyond our walls, I finally understood the position Nolan had built for me. If I stepped in, he kept the title while I absorbed the risk. If I stayed out, he could call me disloyal. Either way, he expected me to protect him from the consequences of having power. For the first time, I decided not to. The regional client called at 80:40 the next morning, and by 80:47 Dad was asking me to come into the conference room. Nolan was already there with his laptop open and 3 production schedules spread across the table. A woman named Diane from the client's procurement team was on speakerphone, and she was not happy. Your proposal guaranteed the first shipment by the 28th, she said. We built our launch schedule around that date. Nolan leaned toward the phone. And we're still working toward it. Tessa had shown me the numbers less than 24 hours earlier. Working toward it was generous. Without paying for rush freight, outside capacity, and overtime, the date was nearly impossible. Dad looked at me. Marin, what can production realistically deliver? Nolan answered before I could. We can hit the 28th if we rearrange the next 2 weeks. I ignored him. Diane, are you asking what we can produce with the capacity currently committed, or what might be possible if we add outside capacity? There was a pause. Currently committed. I gave her the number. It was about 68% of what Nolan had promised. His chair scraped against the floor. That assumes we don't adjust anything. She asked about current capacity. We can adjust it. Then tell her what you're adjusting. Nolan stared at me. For years, this was usually the point where I stepped in. Nolan would promise something ambitious, Dad would look nervous, and I would start rearranging schedules until his promise became reality. Sometimes that was teamwork. Sometimes it was me making sure nobody ever had to see the true cost of Nolan being wrong. Diane asked whether we needed to revise the launch date. Nolan started talking about vendor flexibility. I stayed quiet. Dad told her we would provide a confirmed schedule by the end of the day. The moment the call ended, Nolan shut his laptop harder than necessary. You made us look incompetent. Answered the question she asked. You gave her the worst case number. I gave her the number we can currently support. Dad raised his voice. Enough. Then he looked at me. Can you stabilize this for 1 week? I almost laughed, but nothing about it felt funny anymore. What does stabilize mean? Work with Nolan. Fix the vendor allocation, get production aligned. Give us time to sort out everything else. Everything else, meaning the $38,000, the police, my suspended access. My brother spending weeks telling him I might be desperate enough to steal. Apparently those were side issues now that a client was angry. Do you think I took the money? I asked. Dad looked toward the glass wall instead of at me. That isn't what we're discussing. It's exactly what we're discussing. Nolan pushed back from the table. Or we go. I ignored him. Dad, you removed my authority because you thought there was enough reason to question whether I could be trusted. Now you want me making decisions that could affect one of our largest accounts. So which is it? I never said I thought you stole anything. You didn't have to. You let the police arrive before you even asked me what happened. His face tightened. I was protecting the company? And now you want me to protect it. Silence. If you don't trust my honesty, I said, you don't get to borrow my judgment. Nolan stood. You're willing to lose a client just to prove a point. No. You made commitments. You have operational authority. You get to decide how to meet them. You know this system better than I do. There it was, spoken plainly for once. I looked at Dad. Do you hear that? Nolan shook his head. Oh, come on. He gets the authority because you trust him. I get the consequences because you trust me to fix them. Dad started to answer, then stopped. I didn't wait for him to find a version that hurt less. I walked out. My legs felt strangely weak by the time I reached Tessa's office. She took one look at me and pushed a bottle of water across her desk. Bad. Useful. That doesn't sound useful. I finally stopped arguing with the contradiction. She nodded toward her monitor. Then you picked a good time. I found something you should understand. I immediately held up a hand. Did you go looking through restricted files? No, this is our normal planning export. I use it every week. She showed me the fields. Every project category had dates associated with when it entered production planning and which user groups were authorized to work within it. The regional expansion package appeared there earlier than I expected. I leaned closer. What does this date mean? The project category existed in planning by then. And this one? That's when your user group was added to it. I checked both dates again. The project existed before my permissions included that category. It didn't prove nobody could have used my broader finance identity somewhere else. It didn't prove Nolan had personally made the transfer, but it did undermine the neat story that I had independently created some hidden project, moved money into it, and concealed everything. Can this export be edited? I ask. The report can be regenerated, but I can't rewrite the underlying permission history from here. Who manages that? Or system administrator? Good. Don't ask him for anything yet. Tessa leaned back. You don't look as excited as I expected. Because one timestamp isn't $38,000. I had spent enough time around financial records to know that people saw what they wanted to see when a document supported them. I wasn't going to make the same mistake Nolan had made with my credentials. I needed chronology, not a miracle. When was the first vendor commitment for this expansion? I asked. Tessa thought for a moment. I don't have the financial commitment date, but sales sent production a vendor capacity note before we started planning. I went back through my own emails that evening. I still had messages I had received before my access was suspended, including routine scheduling notices copied to department heads. Buried in one thread was a reference to reserved outside capacity. The vendor commitment was dated Wednesday. The transfer carrying my credentials happened Friday. 2 days earlier, I sat at my kitchen table and put the sequence on paper. Nolan had been pursuing the account. A hidden project category appeared. Production was told Dad approved it. A vendor commitment was made Wednesday. $38,000 moved Friday. But the version being built around me required everyone to believe I had decided to move money into a project I wasn't even part of, to meet a vendor commitment that already existed before the transfer. Someone knew that money would be needed before I supposedly decided to take it. That was the first moment since the police walked in when I felt the shape of the accusation begin to crack, not collapse, crack. The next morning, I met Tessa at a coffee shop before work. She listened while I explained the timeline, then said, "So Nolan did it." "Maybe. Maron? I'm serious. I know he built the project. I know he bypassed me. I know he told Dad I had money problems before the transfer. But I'm not going to make a bigger claim than the records support." "Then what are you going to do?" I turned my notebook around so she could see the dates. "Stop trying to prove Nolan stole $38,000. Her eyebrows went up. "That seems like an unusual strategy. I don't need to solve the whole case. I need to change the question." The police had started with my credentials and asked why I moved the money. I wanted them asking something else, whether the transaction could have happened the way Nolan's version required it to happen at all. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for my family to decide whether they believed me. I took out the officer's card from Tuesday morning and called the number. "This is Maron Calloway," I said when he answered. "I'd like to schedule another interview. I think I can explain what was happening inside the company before the money moved." And this time, I was the one asking for the meeting. The second police interview felt completely different from the first. On Tuesday, I had been sitting across from Officer Ramirez trying to explain why $38,000 carrying my credentials had nothing to do with me. On Friday, I walked in carrying a one-page timeline and a notebook, and I had already decided I wasn't going to tell him my brother was guilty. I was going to show him why the story making me guilty didn't make sense. Ramirez sat across from me with another investigator, Detective Harris, who had apparently been brought in because the missing money was now being treated as more than a simple accounting discrepancy. Harris looked at my timeline. "Walk me through this." I started with the regional expansion package. I explained how projects normally entered our system, how production categories were created, when operations became involved, and why outside vendor capacity required coordination between sales, production, and finance. Then I showed them the dates I had been able to reconstruct from ordinary records. The expansion project existed before my user group was added to that project category. Nolan had already made a vendor capacity commitment by Wednesday. The disputed transfer happened Friday. "Your credentials are still associated with the transfer," Harris said. "I know. So you're saying someone used them?" "I'm saying I don't know exactly how my identity became associated with it, and I'm not going to invent an answer." I tapped the timeline. But the transaction didn't appear out of nowhere Friday afternoon. Someone had already created the project, promised outside capacity, and committed to a vendor before that money moved. I wasn't part of those decisions. Ramirez asked. "Who was?" "My brother negotiated the client and vendor side." "Hear you accusing Nolan of making the transfer?" "No." Harris looked mildly surprised. "Why not?" "Because I can't prove that. What I can prove is that the version where I independently decided to move $38,000 into some secret project doesn't fit how that project actually developed." Harris studied the page again. "Who negotiated the outside vendor?" "Nolan." That was where the questions changed. They wanted the vendor name, who normally approved those commitments, whether Graham knew about the expansion, and why Nolan would have been telling production staff that Dad approved something Dad claimed he hadn't approved. I answered what I could and said, "I didn't know when I didn't. When I left 40 minutes later, nobody told me I was cleared. Nobody promised Nolan would be investigated. But for the first time, I had watched 2 investigators write my brother's name more often than mine. By the time I got back to Calloway, Nolan knew something had shifted. I found him outside the conference room with Dad. They want my vendor communications, he said. He wasn't talking to me, but his eyes were fixed on me. Dad looked confused. Why? Because Maren apparently decided to turn a company accounting problem into some conspiracy. I showed them the project timeline, I said. That's it. Nolan stepped toward me. You know exactly what you're implying. Then it should be easy for your records to correct the implication. His jaw moved slightly. You're willing to tear this place apart to save yourself? Yes, I said. That stopped him. I hadn't meant it dramatically. It was simply true. If protecting the company required me to accept suspicion for something I didn't do, then the company was no longer the thing I was protecting first. Dad looked between us. Nolan, did you commit outside vendor capacity without talking to me? Nolan's attention shifted immediately. It was part of securing the account. We had to move quickly. Did you tell production I approved it? I told them you knew I was pursuing the deal. That isn't what I asked. For the first time, Nolan didn't have a smooth answer ready. He recovered quickly. Dead. This client could change our entire year. I was trying to get ahead of the competition. There was enough truth in that answer to make it dangerous. Nolan probably had been trying to grow the company. That was exactly why Dad wanted to believe him. Dad spent 30 years building Callaway from 2 used presses in a rented warehouse. Nolan talked about expansion in the same language Dad used when he told stories about the early years: move fast, take risks, figure it out afterward. I had always been the person calculating what? Figure it out afterward. Cost. Dad asked me into his office after Nolan left. I need you to stop pushing this inside the company for a few days. I'm not pushing anything inside the company. The investigators are asking vendors for information now. Good. Maren. He lowered his voice. If this regional client hears we have a financial investigation tied to their account, we could lose them. I stared at him. You're still worried about the client. I'm worried about 23 people who get paychecks from this business. So am I. Then help me contain this. There was a time when those words would have worked instantly. Dad only had to mention employees or payroll, and I would start solving whatever problem was in front of us. No, I said. I'm not asking you to lie. You're asking me to stay quiet while my name is attached to missing money because the truth might make a client nervous. Whom asking you to think about the family? I did. Apparently Nolan thought about the family 3 weeks before that when he started telling you I had money problems. Dad looked down at his desk. I should have asked you about that. Yes, you should have. I left before he could turn regret into another request. That afternoon, I sent him a short email confirming what I had already said verbally. While my authority remained suspended, I would provide factual information about work completed under my previous responsibilities, but I would not assume responsibility for new operational decisions. I copied Nolan. His response arrived 12 minutes later. Then another. Then 4 more over the next 2 hours. Where was the approved overflow vendor matrix? Which jobs could be delayed without penalties? How much overtime could production absorb before margins collapsed? Which freight company handled emergency regional shipments? They were reasonable questions. They were also questions the man currently overseeing operations should have known how to answer, or known who was formally responsible for answering. I responded where an existing record or safety issue was involved. I did not build him a rescue plan. At 6:18 that evening, Dad forwarded me an email Nolan had sent him. It was long, polished, and devastatingly predictable. Nolan said my refusal to assist was no longer about the investigation. According to him, I was intentionally withholding operational knowledge to make him fail, destabilize the regional account, and pressure Dad into restoring my authority. In other words, my boundary had become his newest evidence against me. At the bottom, Nolan proposed a solution. He wanted Dad to give him temporary full authority over daily operations so there could be no further ambiguity about responsibility. I read that sentence 3 times. Nolan wanted scheduling authority, vendor authority, client delivery authority. Everything he had spent years treating as secondary to sales. Everything I had been expected to manage whenever his promises reached the production floor. My first instinct was to call Dad and tell him exactly why that was a terrible idea. Then I stopped. Nolan had spent days arguing that I was the problem because I stood between him and control. Maybe I didn't need to convince Dad otherwise. Maybe Nolan needed to get exactly what he was asking for. The next morning, Dad called us both into his office and told me what I already suspected. I'm giving Nolan temporary authority over daily operations until this investigation is resolved. Nolan watched me carefully, waiting for the fight. I looked at Dad instead. Put it in writing, Nolan frowned. That's all you have to say? One more thing. I turned toward him. If you want the authority, make sure the responsibility has your name on it too. For the first time all week, Nolan smiled like he thought he had won. I let him. Nolan got everything he had asked for at 8:05 Monday morning. Dad stood at the front of the conference room and handed out a 1-page authority memo that was much more specific than anything our family had used before. For the duration of the investigation, Nolan had final responsibility for production scheduling, outside, vendor approvals, and client delivery commitments. My name appeared once near the bottom, available for historical clarification only. I took a copy and folded it into my notebook. Nolan noticed. Planning another paper trail, he asked. Dad put your responsibilities in writing. I thought you'd be happy. I am. He looked around the room at Tessa, our shipping coordinator, 2 production leads, and the office manager. From now on, if there's a decision to make, bring it to me. We're done with the confusion. The first supplier call came before the meeting ended. A material shipment needed confirmation because Nolan's regional account required stock we didn't normally carry in that volume. Nolan waved at Tessa. Approve it. It affects 2 other jobs, she said. Then move them. Owen has a guaranteed ship date Wednesday. Nolan paused. Which client? Tessa told him. It was one of our oldest accounts. Nolan looked at me. I said nothing. Move the smaller job, he decided. That was how the next 2 days went. Nolan wasn't stupid. That would have made everything easier. He understood clients, pricing conversations, and how to make a buyer feel like Colloway could solve problems nobody else could. What he didn't understand was how many decisions happened after a contract was signed. Moving one job changed machine time. Machine time affected labor. Different materials changed setup waste. Outside production affected freight. A rush shipment could preserve a deadline while wiping out the margin that made the order worth accepting in the first place. Nolan had always seen those things individually. I had spent 8 years seeing the chain. By Tuesday afternoon, he had rearranged production 3 times to protect the regional account. Each change solved the problem directly in front of him and created another somewhere else. I kept my promise to myself. I didn't sit back and watch something dangerous happen just to prove a point. When I noticed that one material substitution he approved didn't match a customer specification, I told him immediately. That stock isn't approved for the job, I said. Tessa said it would run. It will run. That isn't the issue. The client requires the other grade. Nolan stared at me. So what do I use? That's an operational decision. Marin, just tell me. I'm telling you the constraint. You have the authority to decide what happens next. His face hardened. You know exactly what you're doing. Yes. I'm making sure we don't ship the wrong material. I followed the conversation with a short email documenting the specification issue and my warning. Then I went back to the work Dad had actually authorized me to do. Nolan ended up paying rush freight for the correct stock. The order stayed compliant. The margin got worse. Wednesday morning, the regional client called about its first shipment. Nolan had personally promised a date that depended on outside finishing being completed 24 hours faster than the vendor's written lead time. When Tessa told him that, he blamed production. You knew the deadline. I knew the production target you sent us, she said. I also sent you the vendor lead time Friday. And nobody flagged that it made the date impossible. Tessa opened the folder in front of her and pulled out a printed email. I did. Dad was standing beside Nolan. I watched him read it. Tessa had written, in plain English, that the proposed schedule required either a later ship date or expedited vendor service. Nolan's reply underneath said, "Keep the date. We'll make it work." Dad looked up. "You approved this?" Nolan's answer came quickly. "Because I expected operations to find a solution." He glanced at me. Which would normally happen. There it was again. Even with his name on every decision, failure somehow still bent toward me. I could have reminded Dad that Nolan had specifically requested full authority because I was supposedly obstructing him. I didn't need to. The paper in Dad's hand was doing more than I could. "What's the solution now?" Dad asked. Nolan said they could use emergency freight and pay for priority finishing. "Cost?" Dad asked. Nolan didn't know. Tessa did. Dad's expression changed when she told him. It wasn't dramatic. He just looked at Nolan a little longer than usual. For years, Dad had seen Nolan's sales numbers and my caution and concluded that Nolan created growth while I slowed things down. Now he was seeing what happened after the sales number entered production without someone quietly correcting it. That afternoon, a vendor called Dad directly. I only knew because he came looking for me 10 minutes later. "Do you know why North Valley Finishing has invoices for the regional project under the Bellamy Foods category?" Bellamy was an existing client. I know Tessa showed me production jobs that had been moved under existing categories. I don't know who instructed North Valley how to invoice. They say Nolan did. Nolan was called into Dad's office. I stayed because Dad asked me to explain our normal approval process, nothing more. Nolan didn't deny the instruction. "We needed to reserve capacity before the regional contract was finalized," he said. "If I opened a new project too early, it would trigger review and slow everything down." Dad stared at him. "Review by who?" Nolan hesitated. I answered because Dad had asked me to explain process. A new outside capacity project at that size would normally come through operations and finance before vendor funds were committed. "Meaning Marin," Dad said. "Meaning my department." I corrected. Nolan threw up his hands. "Exactly. We would have spent 2 weeks analyzing an opportunity somebody else was ready to take." "So you hid the vendor work under another client?" Dad asked. "I organized it temporarily. I was trying to win business." His voice had sharpened, but I could hear the logic he had probably repeated to himself for weeks. He wasn't saying, "I wanted to steal from you." He was saying, "I was willing to break the process because I believed success would justify it later." Maybe that had been true at the beginning, but success hadn't come quickly enough. The money had to come from somewhere, and before it did, Nolan had already started building a reason for Dad to look at me. Dad sank into his chair. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I knew what you'd say." "Slow down. Let Marin review it, run another margin model. Meanwhile, we lose the account." Nolan pointed toward me. "She treats every opportunity like a problem." "Because opportunities have costs," I said. "And this one apparently cost $38,000 before anyone even knew it existed." Nolan's eyes flashed. "You still can't prove I moved that money." I didn't say I could. That frustrated him more than an accusation would have. He wanted a fight he could answer. I was giving him dates and processes instead. The next morning, Dad received a request from the investigators. They wanted separate follow-up interviews with him, Nolan, and me. Nobody said much after that. Even Nolan seemed to understand the situation had changed. But my own problem hadn't disappeared. The company was still struggling through commitments Nolan had made, and 23 employees had nothing to do with our family war. That afternoon, Tessa found me sitting in my car during lunch. "How long are you going to let him sink?" she asked. "I'm not trying to make him sink. You know what I mean. You could fix half of this in a day." She was right, And that was what made the question difficult. I had spent the week telling myself Nolan needed to own his decisions. But there was a line between refusing to rescue my brother and using innocent employees as leverage. I needed to know exactly where mine was. If it's safety, compliance, or something that could cause irreversible damage to a customer and I can prevent it, I speak up, I said. If it's Nolan missing a margin, paying rush freight, explaining a delay, or having to solve the problem attached to his own decision, I don't. Tessa nodded slowly. That sounds fair. It doesn't always feel fair. Boundaries usually feel mean to people who benefited from you not having them. I looked at her. Did you rehearse that? A little. I laughed for the first time all week. Then my phone buzzed. It was a reminder for my interview the next morning. Dad's was at 9, Nolan's was at 10:30, mine was at noon. 3 people from the same family were about to sit in separate rooms and explain how $38,000 had moved through the same company. For days, Nolan had controlled the story because he had told his version first. Tomorrow, he wouldn't be sitting beside Dad to fill the silence. He wouldn't be standing behind me while police asked questions. And he wouldn't know what either of us had said before it was his turn to answer. For the first time since this started, nobody in my family would control the room. The records would. By noon the next day, I had stopped thinking of the investigation as a question of who the police believed. Belief was what had gotten me into this mess. Dad believed Nolan because Nolan had planted the right story early enough. Employees believed Nolan when he said Dad approved the expansion because that was how our family business had always worked. The first officers looked at my credentials because the system told them where to look. I didn't need anyone to believe me anymore. I needed the sequence of events to make sense. Detective Harris had my timeline on the table when I entered the interview room. I want to make sure I understand your company's process, she said. That sentence told me more than she probably intended. The first time I sat in that building, they had asked about my mortgage and whether I had personal debt. Now they wanted to understand project permissions. I explained it from the beginning. Sales could pursue a client without operations approval. But once a project required outside capacity, significant vendor deposits, or unusual production commitments, other departments had to become involved. Could you move company money? Harris asked. Generally. Yes. Finance was part of my job. Could you access this regional project? Eventually, yes. But that's why the dates matter. I pointed to the timeline. The project category existed before my user group was added. Nolan had already committed to outside vendor capacity 2 days before the disputed transfer. Production had already been told to categorize work in a way that bypassed normal review. Officer Ramirez leaned forward. So your argument isn't that you lacked access to company funds? Correct, that would be false. Your argument is that the business purpose for this money had already been created by someone else. Yes. Harris turned another page. North Valley Finishing says Nolan negotiated the capacity reservation. That matches what I know. And your father says he did not approve that commitment. That matches what he told me. She asked about the Friday afternoon transfer. I explained where I had been, what Tessa and I had been working on, and the emails I sent from the production floor. Again, none of it magically proved somebody else had touched a keyboard. But combined with everything that happened before Friday, the simple story about desperate Merrin stealing money for herself had started to look ridiculous. Harris tapped her pen against the timeline. Who benefited if you were removed from finance and operations? I knew the answer she expected. Nolan received operational authority. That's not what I asked. I paused. Nolan. She wrote something down. I left without asking what Dad or Nolan had said. I didn't want second-hand fragments that would send me spinning into theories. Dad was waiting for me back at the warehouse, but before he could speak, Harris called with one clarification about Nolan's description of my role. He says you were responsible for financial oversight across the company, she said. Was that accurate? Broadly, yes. He also says that means you should have known about these vendor commitments. There it was. Not Maren took the money. Maren should have known. I almost smiled. Those are two different claims, I said. I was responsible for financial oversight of projects that entered the process. Nolan deliberately kept this project out of my normal review path. You can't bypass someone and then argue their failure to catch you proves they were responsible. Harris was quiet for a moment. Understood. When the call ended, I stood beside my car staring at the screen. Nolan's story had changed. It had to. The original version required me to be the person who created the problem. Now he was arguing I should have prevented it. I had heard variations of that argument my entire adult life. Nolan made the promise. I should have checked the numbers. Nolan bypassed production. I should have noticed. Nolan created a hidden project. Somehow I should have discovered it anyway. Responsibility always flowed toward me even when authority flowed somewhere else. Dad found me 10 minutes later in the small warehouse office. He closed the door and sat opposite me. He looked older than he had a week ago. I should have asked you, he said. I waited. Before I let them come in there. Before I suspended you. When Nolan first started talking about your finances, I should have asked you. Yes, he nodded slowly. I wanted to believe there was an explanation that didn't mean Nolan had done something this reckless. It wasn't the apology people imagine they want. There was no dramatic speech, but it was the first time Dad had named his own choice instead of hiding behind protecting the company. Why was that easier to believe about me? I asked. He looked down at his hands. Because Nolan reminds me of myself when I started this place. I hadn't expected that answer, though I should have. Pushes. He takes chances. Sometimes that's what built this company. And sometimes somebody had to make those chances work. Dad looked at me. You. For years. He nodded. I saw him bringing in business. I saw you worrying about what it would cost. I think I started treating one as ambition and the other as caution. You treated one as leadership and the other as support. That landed. He didn't argue. The investigators asked me about the vendor categories, he said. They showed me enough to understand Nolan was moving ahead without approval. That still doesn't tell you exactly how my credentials ended up on the transfer. I know. I appreciated that more than I expected. Dad wasn't trying to turn one revelation into a perfect answer. They told me Nolan shouldn't have access to the financial or project systems while they continue reviewing it. He said, I've removed him. There it was. 1 week earlier, Dad had removed me because Nolan's story made me look dangerous. Now Nolan had lost the same access because his own decisions had made his explanations impossible to ignore. I need you to take operations back, Dad said. A week earlier, those words would have felt like victory. Instead, I felt almost nothing. Under what authority? He frowned. Maren, Nolan's out. Obviously you'd be running things again. That's not what I asked. You want the title. I want the structure. Dad leaned back. What structure? I opened my bag and handed him 3 pages I had prepared the night before. I hadn't known whether I would need them this soon. The first page defined the Director of Operations role. The second outlined spending and approval authority. The third covered compensation, major transaction review, and production decision rights. Tessa's position was there too, with authority over production decisions that should never have depended on whichever Callaway happened to be standing closest to the machine. Dad read silently. Independent review above this amount? He asked. Yes, heaven for me, especially for ownership. If one person can override controls because his last name is Callaway, then we learned nothing. His eyes moved down the page. This is a lot. So was the responsibility. You've been doing most of this already. Exactly. He looked up. So this is about recognition. No, that's the problem. You still think I'm asking you to finally admit I was valuable. I tapped the document. I'm asking you to stop running a company where responsibility is informal until something goes wrong. Dad was quiet for a long time. "Hond, if I don't agree?" That was the question I had been avoiding for 8 years without realizing it. What if Dad never saw me the way I wanted? What if Callaway never became the place I thought I had earned? Could I actually leave the company I had spent most of my adult life holding together? I was afraid of the answer. But fear and uncertainty were different from having no choice. I stood and picked up my bag. "Then you need a new operations director." Dad stared at me. "You'd leave." "If the only way I can stay is to go back to being responsible for everything and authorized for whatever you feel comfortable giving me." "Yes." He opened his mouth, but I shook my head. "Don't answer today." I walked out of the warehouse before I could start negotiating against myself. In the parking lot, I turned off my company phone. For the first time since Dad founded Callaway Print and Packaging, the business had a problem I knew how to solve, and I wasn't rushing back inside to solve it. The strange part was that I didn't feel powerful, I felt terrified. But as I drove away, I realized power wasn't knowing they needed me. I had always known that. Power was finally knowing I could leave even if they did. I made it until Saturday morning before I reached for the company phone. It was sitting face down on my kitchen counter exactly where I had left it Friday afternoon. For years, turning that phone off had felt irresponsible. Vacations meant checking production updates from hotel rooms. Sunday dinners meant answering vendor emails between courses. If a machine went down at 6 in the morning, I usually knew before Dad did. That weekend, every few hours, I caught myself wondering whether Nolan's regional order had shipped, whether North Valley had finished the outside work, whether Dad had found someone who understood the scheduling mess. Each time, I stopped myself. If there had been a safety or compliance emergency, Tessa had my personal number. Everything else could wait. By Sunday evening, something strange happened. The company kept existing without me watching it, maybe badly, maybe inefficiently, but it existed. I realized I had spent years confusing constant availability with loyalty. Being anxious about every problem had become proof, at least in my own mind, that I cared more than everyone else. Monday morning, Dad called my personal phone. "Can you come in?" he asked. "What happened?" "Nothing happened." That answer alone made me suspicious. "Then why do you need me?" "I want you to review something." When I arrived, the building looked exactly the same as it had before my life inside it changed. The presses were running, a forklift moved pallets near shipping. Someone had left a half-empty coffee cup on the reception counter. There was no dramatic collapse because I had taken a weekend off, and I was glad. I had never wanted the company destroyed. I wanted it to stop requiring me to be destroyed to keep it functioning. Dad was alone in his office. He gave me an update before showing me anything. Nolan had been removed from day-to-day operational and financial access while the investigation continued. The police had made it clear that I was no longer being treated as the primary focus of the missing money inquiry, although they still had questions about exactly how my credentials became associated with the transfer. The company had lost part of the regional expansion work after Dad renegotiated the schedule instead of pretending Nolan's original promises were possible. We would also have to deal with the financial exposure created by vendor commitments Nolan made without approval. It wasn't a clean victory. $38,000 didn't magically reappear. The client didn't apologize. The police didn't march Nolan through the office in handcuffs. Real consequences were messier than that. "And Nolan?" I asked. Dad looked tired. "Still thinks he was trying to save an opportunity." That didn't surprise me. When I left Dad's office, I found Nolan waiting in the hallway. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He looked different without the confidence he had worn all week. But he didn't look defeated. Mostly he looked angry and exhausted. "So you got what you wanted," he said. "What do you think I wanted?" "Me out. You in charge. Dad finally admitting you were right about everything." I almost argued with him, Then I realized that would mean stepping back into the same old conversation where Nolan defined what happened, and I spent my energy correcting him. I wanted my name cleared. Never meant for the police to come after you. I studied him. You told Dad I was having financial problems before the money moved. His eyes shifted away. I told him you seemed stressed. You knew exactly what you were doing. I was trying to keep the company moving. That account could have changed everything. It did. He flinched slightly. Then he said, Dad would never have approved the vendor commitment if I'd gone through the normal process. You would have killed the deal with spreadsheets before we even had a chance. There it was. Not an apology, not really. Nolan still believed the original decision was justified because he believed his ambition mattered more than everyone else's authority. Maybe someday he would understand the rest. I no longer needed to wait for that day. I hope you figure out why you needed me to be the problem, I said. Then I walked past him. Dad had 3 revised documents waiting in the conference room. Tessa was there too, which immediately told me he had taken at least one part of my proposal seriously. I sat down and read every line. Director of Operations. Defined spending authority. Written approval thresholds. Independent review for major transfers and unusual vendor commitments. Tessa would become production manager with formal decision rights over scheduling and production feasibility. No sales commitment above a defined threshold could bypass operational review, regardless of who brought in the client. Most importantly, responsibility and authority were written beside each other, instead of scattered across family expectations. You changed the independent review section, I said. Dad nodded. I made it stronger. He had. But one sentence still gave the Director of Operations responsibility for all operational outcomes, while allowing ownership to override certain decisions. I circled it. This goes. Dad looked at the paragraph. Why? Because if ownership can override the decision, ownership shares responsibility for the outcome. A week earlier, that sentence might have started an argument. Dad picked up his pen. Fair, he changed it. That small moment meant almost as much to me as the title. He wasn't giving me authority as a reward for being right. He was finally accepting that authority came with rules even when the person being limited was him. Dad signed first. I signed second. Tessa signed her new role afterward, grinning at me as she did. Does this mean I get to tell sales no now? She asked. Professionally, I said. I was hoping for dramatically. Start professionally. The following Monday, we held another leadership meeting. There was a new organizational sheet on the wall. My name read, Marin Culloway, Director of Operations. Seeing it felt good, but not for the reason I would have expected a month earlier. I had spent years wanting Dad to recognize how much I did. Now I understood recognition wasn't enough. A compliment couldn't protect me from responsibility without authority. Being the person everyone secretly depended on wasn't power if they could publicly remove me the moment somebody offered them a more convenient story. I also stopped trying to make myself indispensable. Tessa owned production decisions now. Other managers received responsibilities I had quietly absorbed for years. If I took a day off, I wanted the company to function without me. That wasn't weakness. It was what a healthy operation was supposed to look like. The investigation into the transfer continued beyond that month, and the financial consequences of Nolan's decisions didn't disappear overnight. My relationship with him didn't magically repair itself either. Dad and I were better, but different. His apology mattered. It just didn't erase the fact that when he had been forced to choose whom to doubt, he had chosen me. Maybe rebuilding trust would take longer than signing 3 pages in a conference room. I was okay with that. On Tuesday morning, almost exactly a month after the police first walked through our doors, I arrived at 8:30 instead of 7:15. The presses were already running. Tessa had solved a scheduling problem without calling me. Dad was drinking coffee in his office. Nothing was on fire. I sat at my desk, looked at the title beside my name, and thought about the woman who had stood on that same floor while 2 police officers asked where $38,000 had gone. She had desperately wanted her family to believe her. I didn't anymore. I wanted something stronger than belief. I wanted boundaries that didn't disappear when they became inconvenient, authority that matched responsibility, and relationships where loyalty worked in both directions. For years, I thought being needed meant I was valued. It took losing my authority, my reputation, and almost my place in my own family business to understand the difference. Being needed had never guaranteed being trusted. And once I understood that, I stopped trying to be indispensable. I chose to be respected instead. If the people closest to you only recognize your value when you stop fixing their problems, what does that say about the role they expected you to play in the first place?